Tristan, it's so great to have you on the floor plan, especially as a fellow Bondi and a grad from our MBA program. From what year did you finish?
Hi, Libby. Yeah, thanks for having me on. 2012. I actually
2012.
I did the last part of my MBA actually in upstate New York. So I did study abroad at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and I finished. I think it was at maybe the end of 2011, a long time ago now.
Long time ago. But
But yeah, a long time ago. But the people that I met and the content and knowledge that I learnt going through that program, I hold on to that on a daily basis.
it's so good to hear. So I'm so excited to talk to you today because you have just returned to Australia after, I think, about 14 years, roughly,
Yep.
in
Cool.
San Fran at the nexus of where it all happens in innovation and startups as a manager doing some pretty cool stuff at Google, which is the job everyone always wants to hear about. So maybe tell us a little bit first about how you landed from Aussie land into San Fran and at Google.
Yeah, so I mean, even pre-Google, right? I graduated with a Bachelor of Business out of Griffith University on the Gold Coast, and immediately, I didn't even wait for the graduation. I immediately left for London and did what most Australians do, and did my 2+ years in London. Came back and did some work for Queensland Treasury in public sector, working on digital transformation, business transformation projects. Which kind of lent into doing software development and rolling that out. But that was a very holistic sort of program. Got to learn a lot about change management, software development, and so forth. And the GFC, although it didn't really hit hard in Australia, was shielded to some extent. But that was a time where I was like, look, I need to go and brush up my skills. And thankfully the universe put out Bond University's MBA pathway there, and so off I went on that journey while still working. And yeah, as I said before, I had an opportunity to go to the States to finish off my master's degree there. I had full intention of coming back to Australia, honestly. And in the last few months of finishing up, I attended some alumni events in New York, and one conversation led to another, and I was working for a startup, a SaaS startup, startup in San Francisco, immediately after. And I did that for a short period of time, just up to a year. And then Google came knocking on the door, and they're after someone with very specific skills and experience that I possessed, that I had actually acquired at that startup in San Francisco, and that was contact center infrastructure. And so that was 2014.
Oh, wow.
And here I am now, 2025, just moved back to Sydney after an incredible journey in the Valley.
I have been lucky enough to go to a few Google offices over time as part of my research, and we'll talk about the workspace design aspect in a little bit. But the question everyone has, of course, Tristan, is what's it like to work at Google?
Yeah, I mean, the day before I joined in 2014, I watched The Intern. Is it The Intern or The
Yeah.
Internship?
Yeah, the doco.
And it was relatively new back then. I think it had probably been out one or 2 years, and it was too real. It really was. And I started the next day, and I was super jet lagged because I just flown in to get my visa back in Sydney and went back to San Francisco. And I get goosebumps thinking about it now, actually. Some of those
I
early
bet.
months, I was just working with such a rock star team, and just drinking from the fire hose, and taking it all in. And, I was in Mountain View headquarters. So I was
Mm-hmm.
commuting down on the G bus, the Google bus, from the city down the 101. And this is 2014, and things were just like pumping. It was like
Mm.
mobile. I mean, I don't know what your listener, average age group is, but
That's
this,
very wide range. So
yeah,
there'll be plenty of people that will
right.
remember that.
I like to
Mm.
put it in context. Facebook mobile was not a thing at that point. It was just starting to get some traction, and
Mm.
so the Valley was just absolutely pumping. Foursquare, Facebook mobile, Google was just starting to lean into being a mobile first
Mm-hmm.
organization. Uber was about a year old at that point, and so
Wow.
you see, so these technology cycles. You know,
Mhm.
back then, I would say from probably like coming out of the GFC, there was like an accelerated journey for tech at that time, piggybacking off, you know, the emergence of mobile. Obviously, Apple sort of started that wave and the smartphone, and then, you know, Google acquired Android, and off to the races they went. And that just built out that entire ecosystem of gig economy and so forth. So it was a really exciting time to join. Yeah, the Mountain View campus, you know, lived up to its expectations, right?
Just like the doco.
Eh, Right. And yeah, I mean, there's been 60-minute reports and
Mhm.
documentaries and movies, you know,
Mm,
about that. Things have changed. You know,
mm,
the company has evolved. It's not, you know, 10,000 people anymore. It's 165,000 people.
mm,
Um, and so, you know, the flashy nap pods and all that sort of stuff that was present back then has been definitely scaled back.
mhm,
It's definitely scaled back in those larger corporate offices like Mountain View and to some extent like, you know, the bigger ones,
mm,
Singapore
mm,
and London and New
mm,
York. It's funny, some of the smaller, I don't want to say satellite offices, but the smaller offices like, I don't know, Munich or Sydney, they've been able to maintain and retain that sort of that office design that has always been present, you know, for the
mm.
most part,
The
over the
slippery dips
years.
are well and truly gone.
Yeah, I think the slippery dips started going, you know, probably around 2012,
Right.
in some of the offices. Yeah, I mean, there's probably some that are still there, you know, there's
Mm,
some, but I mean, it grew up. The company
mm,
grew up, you know, the people running the organization grew up. The expectations from shareholders
mm,
it continues to get greater and greater. So I think that the lesson here for any organization that's going through rapid growth is you have to evolve, you have to adapt. Otherwise, you kind of get left behind because you've tried to maintain those shiny, nice perks that were once, you know, that's what attracted everyone and kept top talent, you know, retained top talent there. They don't necessarily need that now.
mm.
Or they do, but it's just not
I
cost
do.
effective to do it with
Right.
165,000
That's some
people.
people. So
So, yeah.
during that growth, obviously enormous changes. How do you manage in such a large, complex business? And what were the challenges for you as a manager when everything was changing so rapidly?
Yeah, I mean, managing at Google is all about managing across, not down, not just down. Right?
Mhm,
You're not just leading your direct team. You have to coordinate with numerous functions, product engineering, sales, finance, and more, procurement. This meant that influence mattered more than direct authority,
mhm,
and success often hinged on your ability as a manager to build consensus in complex and often ambiguous situations. Um, you know, as a manager, I think about prioritization was a
mhm,
constant and often political battle. Um, there was always scarcity around resources relative to the company's ambitions. So you as a manager, you're constantly advocating for headcount, budget, and leadership attention. Um, you know, OKRs, whether they're quarterly, annual, um, OKRs being objectives and key results, were great. Are a great tool. They just
mm,
don't eliminate all confusion, as teams often had
mhm,
overlapping mandates and shifting goals. So
mm,
navigating this landscape as a manager really demanded sharp strategic thinking, and a lot of stakeholder engagement.
mm,
So yeah, complex, but you know, you learn to unblock your team, right? Help them because a lot of it is cross-functional, you know.
mm, mhm,
And so the sheer scale that meant that processes like hiring, um, onboarding, product approvals could be incredibly slow. So
mm.
as a manager, you've got to effectively act as a force multiplier, remove friction, advocate for resources, and escalate where needed to allow, you know, momentum to continue
Mm.
going forward.
And I think that's a misnomer, isn't it, that people have that you're in a company like Google, and there are many others that sort of, well, not many, but several that fall into that mythical where you just think, oh, there's unlimited everything, unlimited food, unlimited resources. But the reality is that isn't the case for any company. And you are trying to grapple with, well, my project, I think needs this. And someone, then you've got 100, many, many other managers all doing exactly the same thing in a very rapidly changing landscape, as you said, in terms of technology and things like that. So I imagine influencing skills were very important, and also being able to think strategically as a systems thinker across the business to sort of say, well, it's not just about me and my project, but where does this fit in this overall landscape?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, the bar was high. And I mean,
Mm,
the bar was high on talent. The bar was high on everything, what you delivered,
mhm,
and it was all about impact.
mhm,
And so, coming back to prioritization and influence was, really critical. And I think that applies to any organization where you're having to work across functions.
mm,
That influence is key, but also having the data to back it up, right?
mm,
As a manager, you're trying to build a high performing team, and judging by various metrics, surveys, feedback cycles, and so forth. So you're constantly trying to develop talent,
mm,
um, and prepare folks for promotion, their next step. And so you're constantly navigating situations where you had to manage those high expectations. And if they weren't, sometimes the worst part of management is managing people out.
mm,
Or, and I think Google has done an incredible job over the years, is coach and mentoring. You hit a high bar in order to get into the organization.
mhm,
And so the philosophy was like, well, okay, yes, you could manage them out. A lot of organizations just go, oh, you're not hitting the mark, we manage you out.
mm,
It might be just a case of they're just, what's going on in their personal life. I know
mhm,
this sounds very idealistic, but what's going on in their personal life? Have they been on this team so long that they're no longer being challenged?
mm,
Or is there just friction between their stakeholders
mhm,
where, as a manager, I need to move them into a different project or find a hiring manager on a different team that aligns with what their goals are and put them in another team so they can continue to succeed.
mm,
So I think organizations that are, it's, you have to be very intentional
mhm,
about that, and forward thinking. And so there's programs around that, right? It's just not like leave it up to the individual managers to figure this out. They're very intentional, and that comes, that comes into probably a segue into culture.
mm. Yeah, we talk about that quite often, Tristan, on the podcast. That is a person in the wrong job? Are they no longer being challenged? What else is going on in their life, as you said? And with the coming talent shortage and labor shortage, these things are going to become more important than ever. So, culture, yes, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
For me, culture and innovation are like the two words that go hand in hand at an organization like that, like Google. Yeah, they really are a case study for, having a truly innovative culture. Um, they're at the forefront of digital innovation, and obviously for good reason. Um, they have a company-wide innovation strategy. And so that tends to be around the 9 pillars of innovation. And that's a framework that helps sort of map and prioritize innovation projects and guide employee creativity. All right. And
Mhm,
that filters down to everything, talent acquisitions and
mm,
so forth.
mm,
Um, if I just touch on those pillars, it's like innovation from anywhere. They understood that innovation can come from any employee at any time, in any form.
mm,
Um, that could just be encouraging contributions from every part of the business and not just specific teams. Um, Putting users first, always. And that was a core principle, to put users first and worry about profitability later. There's some
mhm.
famous quotes from Eric Schmidt, former CEO, around, put users first, and money will follow, right?
Right.
And it certainly did with ads, right?
Mm,
If you look at
mhm,
the late 90s and early 2000s, where they were absolutely innovative in that space, they one could argue now that one it definitely comes up a lot now that the user experience when you go to Google is a little dirty. All right, it's sponsored post, sponsored ad, sponsored ad. If you go back to the early 2000s, they put user first, and that experience, that was paramount. That was everything, and that's how they won search,
Right.
by not just stuffing it full of ads. And now we're in this pivotal moment with with AI. It's the companies had to really take a really hard look at that, and pivot quickly before, ChatGPT and others sort of eat their lunch. So always putting the user first. And worry about profitability later. 10x improvement, always shoot for those 10x sorts of projects. And that was like critical thinking around everything that you did was like, oh, it wasn't just like incremental growth. It's like, how do we 10x this? How do we blow it up? What resources do we need? And that is very much the Silicon Valley way of thinking, right? It is
Absolutely.
really like blow it up. Like I had a manager famously tell me, like in engineering, she would constantly say, if you took that project and just made it so much bigger, right? She was challenging me to look well beyond the resources or the scarcity of resources that I might have had on that particular project. What if I had 100 resources on that project, but what if it landed, 100 million instead of $1 million revenue, right? And so you're always challenged to, aim for that 10x improvement and envision world-changing projects. Like
Mm.
Google Maps is a prime example. Instead of just putting paper maps online, they went out to revolutionize trip planning. And they built a system and infrastructure that would learn and improve with every journey,
Mm.
right? And so that led to a truly transformative product. In classic sort of engineering terms, ship and iterate, Google really embraces an iterative process. Pushing products out early and using feedback to refine them. I mean, that's now just like that's what everybody should be
Everyone.
doing.
Yeah.
Everybody should be doing, right? There's this notion of waterfall methodology and waiting months to ship something. You just don't do that in software anymore. And
Mm-hmm.
now, with AI, you can literally go and push it out into the public sphere, and
Mm.
within minutes get feedback, and the tool will improve itself,
Mm.
right? And so it really is, the mantra of, move quickly and break things and move quickly. I think you can move quickly. You don't have to break things though, right?
Mm.
Particularly as the scale gets, considerably larger and the risks get larger. You don't have to break things, but you can still be very agile. And one other thing I'll touch on, just like, the culture is just around 20% time.
Mm.
Probably not as um, popular as what it used to be, but 20% time at Google was similar to 3M's policy. If you remember the company 3M,
Yes.
kind of
Yeah, of
become a
course.
little bit irrelevant, but it
The
still
post-it
exists.
note. I still love the post-it note.
Right. So, Google allowed employees to dedicate a portion of their time to pursue passion projects
Mm.
that it always had to benefit the company, of course. So popular innovations like Gmail, AdSense, which is, creative
Mm.
billions of dollars of revenue,
Mm.
started off as 20% time projects. Um, I will say that it always felt like 120% time sort of projects, but that was fine because if you're enjoying your surrounding and your environment and you love the people that you're working with, you're more than happy to put in that extra 20% because you're getting
Exactly.
something out of it as an individual, and the organization is hopefully benefiting from it at some point. Didn't have to be immediate, but they've got deep pockets to ride these things out and keep on iterating to a
Mm.
point where they'll, be the next billion user product.
Yeah. And Tristan, I think, how do you manage that? Because this is a question that companies grapple with all the time, isn't it? Well, we don't have enough time to do that, but also that managing risk, as you said, you don't necessarily have to break everything, but a lot of companies still struggle with this idea of let's just try, let's iterate, there's that fear. And then employees have this perhaps even inherited fear of like, oh, my last company, I'm going to get in trouble if I do that.
Right. Yeah, there is, I think particularly at the moment where there's a lot of shift happening in the workforce and roles being made irrelevant, redundant, but that's also opening up opportunities. I think there is a little bit more risk associated with being super innovative for at the individual level.
Mm.
Like I will say that some people will hesitate on joining a team that hasn't got a lot of traction because they're doing something really innovative,
Mm.
but they're like, well, if I go and join that team and the investment or the funding or the strategy changes and the rug gets pulled underneath that team, then, well, where's my next role going to be? And so job security starts creeping into the mindset there.
Mm,
So, I mean, I think it depends on the individual, as
for
well.
sure.
I mean, honestly, I'd much prefer to risk, my career and work on, what something, on the cutting edge, bleeding edge of technology or whatever it is, rather than just go and work for some legacy incumbent company and just have job security. That doesn't
Mm,
interest me, but yeah, it might for
other
other
people.
people.
Yeah. And the other next burning question that you probably get every single day, Tristan, is AI. What's happening? The workplace. What are you seeing from where you sit?
Yeah, not a conversation these days goes by without AI coming up in some way, shape, or form, right? It's a fascinating and rapidly evolving space. Um, from my perspective, business should be incredibly excited about it. Um, Having just recently moved back to Australia, it's a very different, and I think the media is to blame to some extent here. They're definitely projecting out fear, some fear mongering around AI and how it's going to take people's jobs and all this sort of stuff. Whereas back in the States, particularly in Silicon Valley, it's very much like we're building, we're building this new technology, and we're trying to and these builders and innovators are trying to change the world for good. And so I'm optimistic. And I think it's just it's no different from when we started getting electricity or the internet in the 90s. I think this is just another technology wave, and we will adapt as a human race. Um, yes, things are happening probably a little bit more rapidly, but opportunities will present themselves to folks that didn't even know existed. Right.
Mm,
So I would just say, keep on experimenting. I'd say this to my parents. I love having a chat with my parents, and they're like, oh, we use Gemini to like help us with our travel plans. I'm like, that's great. At least they're experimenting,
mm,
and they're getting familiar, and that will lead to using something else. So, I'm excited about it. The opportunities are truly tremendous, both for individuals and society as a whole. I think it's really paramount that we get it right, right?
mm,
And there's guardrails, around that. I think we're in a moment now where AI at work is becoming quite real. Jobs are going. Just saw this week with some news out of Atlassian, right? That it is becoming real.
mm.
The use of generative AI has rapidly accelerated, with a large proportion of global knowledge workers now using it. Um, what I think, and why the traction is happening is because employees want to use AI at work. We as humans look for the path of least resistance, right?
Definitely.
I don't want to wait for my employee to catch up and give me access to a tool and all these sorts of things. I want to go and use it. And so that concept of BYO AI is now a real thing. Um, so, employers are bringing their own toolkit
Mm-hmm,
to work, right? Their
mm-hmm.
own AI toolkit to work. Um, and so this user-led adoption is a testament to how people feel overwhelmed by the pace and volume of work. And so they're turning to AI for relief, to become more productive and creative.
Yeah, absolutely. It's yeah, stay tuned. It's as you said, every single day there's some development and change, and it's just really hard to keep up. I think a lot of companies do feel overwhelmed, but great advice about just iterating and trying and just starting, and you'll evolve from there.
I mean, I mean, AI can help liberate workers from
Mm,
menial tasks. And
yes.
so it allows the individuals to be innovative and be able to create and flourish. I don't need somebody at work to tell me I want to be able to do that.
Mm,
And so it's just a matter of experimenting. Now, the number of tools that comes out on a near daily basis, it is overwhelming.
mm,
And so it's kind of, you know, pick your tool, whether it's Anthropic's Claude or Google's Gemini or OpenAI ChatGPT or Lovable, Cursor, Replit, whatever it is,
mhm.
master it, right? And hope it doesn't get deprecated or, go out the back door.
Exactly. But you've learnt some valuable skills that no doubt will be transferable. Tristan, workplace design, Google, probably from my lens of the world, working and researching in this space, was the one that put this on the map. But before Google, there were, of course, a few examples historically that I think, IDEO and others, but, Google was the one that got it into the media. So I'd love to hear a bit about the workplace design process and Google's approach to design thinking.
So KB here, I'm no expert on workplace design, but being on the receiving end of it, I have nothing but praise and admiration for Google's real estate and workplace team. Um, they're so underpraised. I mean, honestly,
Yeah.
you think about the offices, their offices conjure up images of playful and whimsical spaces.
Mm.
With slides, climbing walls, nap
Great
pod,
food.
great food, massage, wellness centers, yoga classes, swimming pools, gyms. I mean, I could go on.
Mm.
But at the end of the day, why do they do that? It's very intentional. They're not just adult playgrounds. They're designed with a very clear purpose, and that is to make employees happy, healthy, and comfortable, believing that a thriving workplace would lead to a thriving company. So, the nap pods were there. Honestly, I don't know.
Did you ever use one?
Early days, right, where I might have had a spare half hour up my sleeve in my calendar. Like, when you're a manager there, no. Like, I don't know many
No
people
time.
that no, there was no time. But I mean, the grandstanding looks good from the outside, but the nap pods were there because the brain needs to disconnect and reconnect to, refocus on productivity.
Absolutely.
So I think when they design their spaces, I think they're aimed for longevity and timelessness. Seldom did you ever see an office, get the interior being retrofitted or updated. I don't think I ever saw. Yeah, maybe I saw a couple of offices that were updated, but I think the longevity piece they invested really well in the early days to make sure that those offices met the criteria, around happy, healthy, and comfortable, folks, so they could be productive. It's like the micro kitchens. I think like no one could be seated anywhere further than like 30 feet. I might have got this wrong, but 30 feet from a micro kitchen. And the micro
Brilliant.
kitchens, and the micro kitchens were, it was like a template. You knew it was a bit like McDonald's. You knew what you're going to get there. There was an espresso machine. You know, shout out to all my coffee lovers. A fridge with, fruit juices and, soda drinks were at the bottom of the fridge behind a frosted sort of glass, right? Because they were trying to encourage healthy,
Hmm.
consumption, and some snacks, and there'd be some fruit, stuff like that. And it didn't matter where you went around the world. The micro kitchens typically were the similar layout, obviously different products, localized for those needs. Getting away from that for a second, I think the design focused on creating three types of spaces: deep focus for collaboration and meetings, and for building community and sparking innovation. Um, yeah, I think about like the latest building in Mountain View headquarters, the Bayview campus. They were really designed to support neighborhoods where teams could be under the same roof, fostering a sense of community and belonging. That campus offered a variety of collaboration spaces, tons actually, meeting rooms to lounges, quiet spaces for individual focus. And they just recognized that a singular space would be very distractive. Like not everyone likes being in an open office,
No.
right? Um, but I think it's important to remind listeners of your podcast that Google has super deep pockets. They can afford to do this. And so startups who are bootstrapping and trying to be scrappy have to be innovative here. You have to be thinking outside the square because, not everyone has billions of dollars to go and drop on this type of, physical space and infrastructure to do this. So I see it here in Sydney. We've, visited a couple of VC firms recently, and some of their spaces are incredible. And they didn't have to spend, billions of
Billions of
dollars or
dollars.
millions of dollars on this
Mm.
sort of stuff. I think Australians have fantastic design thinking,
Mm.
at their core. So I think we've got a bit of a leg up in that space.
And
So
design's been really democratized, hasn't it? You know, that you can go to different, there's all these shows on TV, you can go to IKEA, you can look at the pictures online, and you can do a lot yourself if you're a small startup, as you said.
absolutely, absolutely. And you've got to be thinking about that physical space and now sort of seamlessly blend your physical with your digital
Mm.
workspace. Because not everyone wants to be in the office, 5 days a week. And if they're not, and you've got a hybrid policy or a remote policy, you have to think about, how does that shape your physical space? Because if there's folks being remote and you want to bring them for in-person collaboration, you need to be able to have spaces that can facilitate and enable that type of interaction.
Definitely. And design thinking, is that just a way of life at Google?
I think it is for a lot of teams and a lot of roles, not across the entire board, but I think design thinking has sort of come to the fore over the last decade. And I think a lot more people are intentional about, particularly the design of the space, right down to the individual space, as well as, cafeteria space. And what are they trying? What is the intention behind that? Like cafeterias, right? Google's more than happy for a line to grow at midday for folks to grab lunch because the intention was it would spark conversation with
Mm.
people that you don't necessarily work with that might be on other teams. And so there was always intent
Mm.
behind layouts
Yeah.
and how things
Yeah.
operated.
Yeah. We'd like you to wait because then you may, yeah, as you said, those serendipitous encounters we know are so, so, so important. So I'm curious now also, Tristan, about this transition that you've come back to Australia and you've been in this incredible way of thinking, way of operating, spaces. And people talk to me quite a lot nowadays with whether they're Gen Zs who are looking at what do I do with my career, the portfolio career? Do I want to go into a long corporate career? Or people who might be at your stage of career who are thinking, I'm going to change. But I don't really know what I want to do. And I think it's easy when you've been at a company like Google or any really big corporate where your job and the company, and to some extent, becomes a big part of your identity. And I know listeners are grappling with this right now because there is a lot of complexity and uncertainty around what should I do next? Maybe I'm burnt out. We know a lot of people are burnt out. They want to do something different. But what thoughts would you have just from being at the start of navigating this process yourself of this shift in identity and what's next?
Yeah, as you said, you do build a personal brand at an organization that you've spent a number of years at. I was fortunate to have spent 11 years at Google, and I moved into three very different areas. Right, I went from the ads business, ad sales, system infrastructure, and pivoted over to a engineering team, and then later into Google Cloud, into a biz ops strategy and operations sort of space. And how I did that was purely because of my brand and my internal network. Now, being on the outside, this is something that I think about every day. I don't, yeah, I obviously I have a network for sure, but what is it that I want to do now after being in corporate for so many years? And this stretches, back into the early 2000s when I started my career. One thing for me right now in my life is I would like to take a break from corporate. And I think a lot of people that have been in corporate for a very long time have
Mm.
that desire to get out of corporate. And for me, it's to come back to Australia, share my knowledge, albeit it's not great, but I've got some knowledge,
Oh, you definitely have lots of
and I've got
knowledge.
some
Yeah.
knowledge and experience
Mm.
and battle scars
Hmm.
of being in the trenches, both in the startup ecosystem and big tech in
Mm.
Silicon Valley. Is now I want to sort of use that to help Aussie founders,
Hmm.
um, and maybe do some operational work with them, help them sort of get from 0 to 1 in
Mm.
terms of product market fit, and then expansion if that's what if in international expansion if that's what they're looking for,
Mm.
um, and do some investment, right?
Mm.
when I left Australia, the tech, you know, industry was tiny. Yeah, there was a little
Yes.
bit here and there. Atlassian had been around for just over a decade. Canva didn't exist, I don't think, back in like, 2011. Um, so to be able to come back now, with 14 years of living in Silicon Valley, it's it warms my heart to some extent that we now have a VC ecosystem in Australia,
Mm,
right? Who are raising funds to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars to help Aussie founders and Kiwi founders
mm,
um, compete and play at an international and global level.
mm,
And so I want to be part of that now. So if I think about myself, it's like, what are areas that I'm interested in? What are areas that I'm passionate in? And who are the people I want to spend my time and work with going forward? And so that's where I'm at the moment, and figuring out and assessing who are, there's obviously some incredible startups at the moment. Things like Heidi Health here in Sydney are doing just some phenomenal stuff. And obviously I'm looking to ride on this AI hype wave, because it is a
mm,
hype. Um,
mm,
and that's what I think about my own career at this point. Is like, how do I get onto that, and help from an operations,
mm,
strategy and operations perspective, to help this amazing technology get out and improve the lives of people out there.
mm. Yeah, I think that's great advice. And lastly, Tristan, for those who are maybe at the other end of their career, and I know a lot of listeners will definitely have this question. Okay, I want to work for Google or a Google. How do I do it? How do I get there?
Um, uh, I'll just say I'm glad I'm not a graduate right now. I, yeah, how do you stand out? I think the yeah, everything's been flipped on its head in the last, say 3 to 4 years. How do you stand out? I see, amazing graduates coming out and sitting on the sidelines for a couple of years because they can't find an a junior investment analyst role, or
Mm,
a junior engineering role, because companies are like really hesitant at the moment. They might have stopped, the big accounting firms might have slowed down on their intern or
mhm,
graduate programs, because
mm,
they're just sitting to see what's happening with technology and the true impact of what AI is having on that role. So how do you stand out? How do I actually think now, right now, if I was a graduate, I don't know if I'd want to go and work for a hyperscaler, or, I mean, they've become a bit of a safe bet.
mm,
Um, Personally, I'd love to, I'd look at the startups. If
mm.
you're coming out of university with skills that people 4 or 5 years out of university may not have,
Yes.
because the last 3, 4 years have been a really pivotal moment.
Mm,
Um, for learning, how to use AI, leverage it in your own work environment, and so forth. So, um, building in public has become a thing, right?
mhm,
You've got to be vulnerable. You've got to put
mhm,
yourself out there. You got to get comfortable with it. Um, Experimenting. If you are a technical person, you've got to be
mm,
experimenting with all the different AI tools out there,
mhm,
to just become familiar and to be able to speak the language, and know what it can and can't do, and so forth. Um, Getting into big tech, I mean, your network. Yeah, I mean, I'd really advise, and I see this in the US. Everything is like network driven. Yeah, I get it. It's really difficult when you're in your early 20s. You don't have a huge network.
no,
So you've got to put yourself out there. And I constantly get, DMs through LinkedIn from Bondies, Bond University
mm,
graduates,
mm,
asking for advice or a connection to somebody here. I mean, you've got to put yourself out there. And if you don't
mhm,
ask, you'll never know.
mhm,
And just be prepared for some level of rejection or no response.
definitely.
I definitely do my best to connect folks
Mm,
where I can.
yeah, but
There's
I
no
think that's it.
no golden answer there.
Yeah, exactly. But I think what you've touched on there is, think laterally, and the networking, volunteer for conferences, for industry events, go and help startups, look at where community is happening in the spaces or the organizations you want to be in, and show how you can add value and build those relationships, because everyone thinks that's the thing, that's going to make the difference now. But truly, that's been the thing that's made the difference forever.
Yep.
And it's not going to change with AI or not.
Exactly. I mean, the fundamentals are exactly the same.
Exactly.
It's just a technology cycle, innovation cycle that is rapidly evolving, and that doesn't change the way in which how you go about, securing your first graduate position.
Exactly. Tristan, thank you so much for your time today. So much that you've been able to share behind the scenes at Google that I know listeners are going to find so much value in. So we really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having me on. And if anybody would like to continue the conversation, they're more than welcome to reach out to me via X, Twitter, or on LinkedIn.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Tristan.
Thanks, Libby.